complicated. We could start and finish the whole session by saying, well, it's obvious. Violence is the opposite of governance, and it's the end of and the opposite of and possibly a product of the lack of development. End of story. But I think it's a bit more complicated than that. I was trying to remember why I put that one up there to start with. That was probably just to wake you up. Do you know what that is? Just have a little look at that and see what you think it might be. In terms of the links between kind of governance issues, legitimacy issues, money, all right, and development and violence, this is quite interesting. This is a Walt Disney, right, war bond issued by the US government during the Second World War. In other words, in order to try and persuade people, right, to sign up, to put their money into, to lend to the government, to the state, so that it could carry on its war effort against Nazi Germany and so on and so forth. And it's interesting that kind of, so it's not just that this is something that is a problem, the management of economic development, resources and violence through the state, but it's also related to how the state, trying to get these resources, relates to its people, to society. And part of the persuasive mechanism here was trying to use some sort of ideas of popular culture to try and, why that's going to make me give my money to the state to pursue a war, I'm not quite sure. I'm either going to do it or I'm not going to do it. I'm not quite sure I need to be linked to Walt Disney in terms of doing that, but it's quite an interesting example. Okay, so what I wanted to start with is talking about some simple analytical ways we might think about the connections between these things, right? And then I could get bogged down on it, but I want to talk a little bit about trends. Some of the estimates of levels of violence of different kinds. Because we're talking about something called the violence problem, we could call it, okay? How do different societies and states manage the violence problem? Does it ever really totally go away in any society? Or is it just managed? And one way to get at the idea of the significance of the violence problem is to look at trends, how we measure it, what is included and what's not. It's actually a very big discussion, that, but we'll try and touch on it a little bit. And then I want to go on to talk particularly around some arguments, really two very different arguments. One is an economist's argument about why there are wars in poor countries, right? When there are. Why there aren't always, but why there particularly are when there are. Okay? Rooting the origin of civil wars in particular in economic thinking, economic behavior. Not ideas, not politics, individual economic calculations. And that sort of argument is tied to the general idea that violence is, or that war is development in reverse. Okay? And that development itself retards violence and war. Development is conflict prevention. That's the idea. So then I want to talk about a rather different argument. The argument that actually development itself is very conflictual, always, and often violent. And those two ideas don't quite go together very easily. So those are the sort of big themes that I want us to try to talk about a bit, if we can. And you could start with sort of one of the, I don't know, you've probably had about 17 different definitions of governance this week, all right? But if we just work with a simple idea of governance as the kind of rules that regulate the relationship, for example, between states and societies. You can have corporate governance, etc., but let's just take that easy one. Now, those rules, can include the rules about violence. Who is allowed to use violence in a society, and under what conditions? What are the rules that regulate the use of the violence, even if certain groups apparently are allowed to use it. Put it a different way. We often talk about rights allocation, distribution, like property rights. What's the allocation of property rights? That's a governance issue, an institutional issue about the rules of ownership of property, so on and so forth. How do we think through the allocation of violence rights? Not property rights, violence rights. Is it obvious? How are the rules designed that determine whether I'm legitimately allowed to use violence for certain ends, or I'm not? Think about it. This happens in different ways in different societies. In some societies, there are rules. Maybe they're not written down in a legal code, but they're sort of informal, but they're formalized in a non-legalistic way over a long period of time. Rules according to which, if somebody hurts or kills someone in my family, it's perfectly legitimate for me then to kill someone in their family. The kind of idea of the feud. In many European societies historically, and many other societies more recently, and arguably in parts of southern Europe still, the feud, okay? That's a rule system, an informal governance of violence issue. Then there's the idea that in certain countries at certain historical periods, violence is a class thing. It's a class privilege. Okay? Not a state monopoly, a class privilege. Which class? Okay. So, for example, in my country, I'm wearing my national dress, by the way. I hope that's all right with you. We were conquered by William of Normandy in 1066, quite a long time ago. And he arrived in this strange little island where I come from. And in England then, violence was the privilege of the aristocracy, okay? The feudal aristocracy, the big landlords. It was perfectly legitimate for them to use violence against each other. The state, the king, didn't have quite the same rights. Then what you had over time was a struggle which eventually produces new rules, new institutions, new governance of violence rights. And that process is one through which the state, in the form then of the monarchy, the king, wrested violence rights away from the feudal aristocracy. Okay? It was difficult at first. But they did it partly through force itself, and superior force, partly through allowing some, we'll come back to this, decentralized violence for a while, because they knew they couldn't overcome it. So you just let that happen for a while. We'll deal with it later. But also going over the heads of the feudal aristocracy to the wider population to say, look, you support us, we will protect you against the violence of these nasty feudal lords, okay, the landlords. And then over time we end up with what we all think of as the main institutional idea about violence rights, which is Weber's principal definition of the state, the modern state, in terms of a set of organizations, all right, which has the monopoly on the legitimate use of force. That's what we think of states as, primarily. The state has the monopoly on the legitimate use of force. Okay. So that's a different set of rules there. And over time, okay, well, so you have to kind of look at that. We just can't assume that. Where does it come from? How does that monopoly come about? Once you've established that monopoly on the legitimate use of force and you call yourself a modern state, does it end there? Or are there still negotiations, changes over the rules? What's going on in England now, for example, is we have a debate about the rules about when the police force are allowed to use armed weapons. Okay? When they can basically shoot a suspect. Because there was a case very recently, and there was a debate about whether it was, lawful, whether it was right, whether they had sufficient cause to kill this guy, okay, in a car in North London. So we're constantly negotiating and adjusting and refining the governance of violence, right? Even in rich industrialized advanced societies, so-called advanced societies. Now, the other thing historically, this is a big issue, but let's introduce it, is the argument, if we look at how this thing emerged, particularly in Western Europe, is the idea that that's what states are. States are violent. There's a very famous argument by the brilliant, wonderful Charles Tilly, who unfortunately died a couple of years back. He was an American sociologist and historian. And his argument was, states make war. That's what they do. And war makes states. Have you come across that argument before? It's an interesting one. It's that certainly if you look at the kind of historical origins of modern, industrial, advanced, democratic, good governance states, so on and so forth, you will find that they have origins in this dynamic as war-making entities. It's what they did. They pushed violence out from the center, the internal violence, to their borders. And then they really justified themselves in terms of being war makers. Legitimacy. And over time, war then made the state and helped the state develop into its more modern forms. The mechanism of that was really interesting. The argument's like this. We're talking, I suppose, the 16th, 17th centuries in Western Europe. The technology of war changes. War becomes more sophisticated, but more expensive. And because it becomes more expensive, states have to find a way, in order to survive, and they don't all survive, they have to find a way to mobilize resources, like that Mickey Mouse cartoon thing I showed you earlier. All right? They've got to mobilize resources in order to meet these rising costs of warfare. How do they do that? They could borrow. Okay, you can borrow. Many people borrow in order to pursue warfare. The trick is, can you actually do it sustainably and pay it back, so on and so forth. And you can only do that if your economy is producing more and more. But the other main way, and this is very important, is you tax people. Most modern taxation institutions come from the need to pay for war. The bureaucracy of taxation, most of its origins are from the need to pay for war. Okay? But the idea is, if I'm going to tax all of you because I want to fight a war against country B, okay, why would you let me do this? Why would you say, yeah, sure, fine, have some of my income and my surplus and so on and so forth. Go ahead and fight your little war. And take one of my children and for your army and kill her or him and so on and so forth as well. Well, over time, in order to tax you, if I become more efficient of that, I'm only really going to be able to keep this up if I persuade you not only that I'm wonderful and that this war is a tremendous thing to keep at, but that I give you something back in return. Which may, just to cut the story short, be rights over my decision-making process as the state. In other words, democratization. So the idea is that war, over time, states like to make war. War and the economics of war and the technology of war leads to governance changes in terms of the relationship between states and their societies, that in turn, over time, might then produce changes in state behavior. Okay? Does that, I can tell that as a very pretty story about European historical development. Do you think that kind of argument, that kind of historical dynamic or logic, has any relevance in African, Middle Eastern, South Asian societies nowadays? Tell me. Yes or no, but tell me why. Is there any of that dynamic going on nowadays? Or is there something different about the world now which means it doesn't happen like that? Please help me out. Yeah.
No.
No.
Because resolving the disputes or differences.
Do you just, sorry to interrupt you, do people just talk like this or do you have a microphone? Because have we got a mic somewhere? Because The air conditioning makes it hard for us to hear each other. But go on anyway. Go on. Okay, so there's one argument, which is that, at least for some countries nowadays, things are different because the war that states get involved in, they very often they're internal, and they're not legitimate. That's your argument. There's no legitimacy. So these dynamics of kind of institutional change, improved governance through warfare and so on, they're not really happening. Is that right?
Between and within.
Both between and within. Okay.
Between states and within states.
Anyone else want to add to this? Yep.
Like the state use it, or like the tribal, some of the tribes have their own army.
Yes.
They're not willing to surrender that. So
Okay. But that's exactly what happened in England, you could say. All right? But a long time ago. I mean, one of the things here is, or one of the ways of sort of avoiding the arguments you're trying to make is to say, look, if you have a historical view on this, you would understand that these changes don't happen overnight. They're terribly uneven, they're unpredictable, because it didn't always work like that before, and it doesn't now, I agree with you. But things can take place quite slowly in terms of these changes. And that's one of them. You know, this idea of kind of how you reallocate rights over violence. You talked about tribes. It might be regions in a country or whatever groups it might be. You know, you gradually try and centralize that. I mean, it's an interesting one where I almost didn't want to mention a single country here because you all know more than me, and so you'll shoot me down for whatever I say. But, you know, look at the different parts of Somalia in terms of different ways of trying to deal with this. Not very successfully in one bit, arguably more successfully in another. So on. So, you know, arguably these are some of the dynamics. Whether they're having these longer term implications in terms of changes or not, that's maybe we wait to see. The world is different because the context is different. The globalized governance context, the global political and arms markets and so on and so forth. All of these things are different. It's never going to be quite the same. There's also an argument. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah,
Okay. What if I, just for argument's sake, if I say to you, let's take Uganda. And I say, you're absolutely right. It inherited a kind of colonial shell of a state. Yeah? But it wasn't really, you know, there wasn't the kind of rich institutional linkages, the social contract, so on and so forth. And it had crisis after crisis. Horrible, really horrible. But that gradually, out of that, emerged a different form of governance in Uganda, which arguably is not perfect. It's got a long way to go, but it's a lot better than what there was. And it's more of a kind of a state developing from within rather than just a sort of shell from outside. I don't know. Does that make any sense? Maybe. So there may be some of these dynamics. One of the arguments against this is to say, look, it's not like that nowadays because there's too much oil rent or diamonds rent or foreign aid. And the problem is, if you can get lots of rent from oil or lots of rent from foreign aid, then you don't need to tax people. And if I don't need to tax people because I can get lots of foreign aid and so on and so forth, then I've got no incentive to forge that social contract, that relationship. That's one argument. So you might say in somewhere like Angola, one of the arguments is this is the problem. There's too much easy money for the state because of the oil and oil-backed loans from China and so on and so forth, so that the Angolan state has not really got the incentives to develop that legitimacy. Even there, I think that's actually not quite right, and recent events in Angola are showing that there is a political edge, there is an internal dynamic. Anyway, you know, this is an interesting way to sort of start to think about it. We can talk about it more later. But nonetheless, we have states of some kind or other, right? And we have a violence problem that varies. It's not the same in Somalia as it is in Ghana, as it is in Lebanon or wherever, okay? Or Brazil or England or whatever. There is a violence problem always. How is it managed? Particularly through and by states. Two related ways of doing this. One I think James was talking to you about yesterday probably quite a lot. One is the one around coalitions. Okay? States have to kind of build coalitions, right, in which increasingly people agree not, to give up their right to violence. Elite coalitions. We'll talk more in a while about what might underpin that bargain, that coalition. But the other way is through, it may be that economic development does the trick of managing the violence problem in two ways. One is it might change the incentive structure around coalitions. Okay, we'll come back to this. The other is it just might more generally mean that people they're just less interested in using violence. They're more interested in making money. They're happier, they've got jobs, they're making profits, whatever it might be. So these two things together, the more the political, institutional, organizational, and the more economic, are very important. There's a third side to this, which is the management of force itself. There's a superb book by somebody called Antonio Giustozzi, which I probably can't spell, but Angelica and Sebastiana can. Tell me wherever they've gone, how you spell it. I can see if I can remember. Anyway, it's called The Art of Coercion. Okay? And Antonio's argument is this, which is that, and this is really important for governance, and Risha has to shut her ears whilst I'm talking for a bit, but which is this, which is that historically, recent history and long-term history, to get this monopoly on the legitimate use of force involves two phases. First, something called the primitive accumulation of a monopoly of force. And that's nasty. All right? The beginning, the first phase, is always brutal. It's raw power. The claimants to the state have to say, have to destroy rivals, and so on and so forth, and really impose their force. Then they have the second phase, which goes on almost forever, and that's about sustaining, preserving, maintaining this monopoly on the legitimate use of force. Partly through kind of legitimacy issues, but to all sorts of organizational adjustments to the police, the rules that govern police violence, militias, the army, etc., etc. Okay? Now, there are two important parts to this argument of Antonio's. One is that there's no blueprint. That there's an extraordinary wide range of different ways in which states and societies have addressed these challenges of the initial accumulation of the monopoly of force, and then its kind of legitimate maintenance. So diversity rather than blueprint, historically. And secondly, across that range of ways of dealing with this, very little, at least until much later in the game, very few of these examples, these different ways of dealing with the challenge, have anything to do with the recommendations that now flow to lower income countries from richer countries about good governance in security sector reform. What you're supposed to do now, and I think it's a good idea, it's a very, very desirable thing in Kenya or wherever, of course you would want this, is to have ministries of justice, security sector, police reforms which are transparent and accountable and so on and so forth. And these are good things, but Antonio's argument would be that good things though they are, they actually make it harder to kind of organize a stable coalition that really disincentivizes the decentralized violence, the threats to the state, so on and so forth. I'm not saying this is right. I'm just saying this is an interesting argument you need to play with in your heads. That although the goal might be really legitimate, transparent, accountable management of the rules around the police and the army and when they can do what they can do, right? It's not, you can't just sort of say do it and then it'll happen and everything will be lovely in DRC or wherever. The process of getting there is really much more challenging than that. Okay, yeah, hello. Giustozzi, you spell it Giustozzi. Giustozzi. The Art of Coercion. Superb book. Right. This is a bit more. We can think about, in terms of, just to skip back a bit, when we talk about the violence problem and the fact that it's kind of perpetual and it's pervasive, we don't just mean wars, okay? We don't just mean state repression. We mean also, in terms of the governance of violence, the rules around what, for example, husbands can get away with against wives. I believe this is a governance issue. The violence problem is something that reaches into households. If you want, I mean, the data are not good, but if you want to know how pervasive violence is, you need to look not only at the wars, you need to look at the pervasiveness of intimate partner violence, intra-household violence in many societies. Horrific. It's a very important social problem. It involves rules. So, for example, you know, there are societies which have nice institutional innovations such as women-only police posts, so that women feel more confident going to them and sort of saying what's happened to them, so on and so forth. But it also involves beliefs and legitimacy issues around what's right, what's allowable, so on and so forth. Anyway, so the violence problem is a very, very pervasive one and needs to be taken seriously at all these levels, I believe. Okay, now, three broad ways we might think about the links between governance and violence before we look at the development angle a bit more. One is that we might say, as I said at the beginning, violence is obviously an indicator of the lack of governance. It means there are no rules. The rules have broken down. Okay? Things are unraveling. DRC, Somalia, wherever. That's fairly obvious. Or in parts of cities. You know, there may be a country that's not at war, but there may be parts of cities or rural areas where the rules just aren't working. There are rules, there are governance relationships, but they're not, informally and formally, they're not quite working, and therefore there's a lot of violence. Okay, so violence may be an indicator of a lack of governance, good or otherwise. Secondly, it may be, if we take the good out of governance, that actually violence is a reflection of governance. It's just a form of governance. Remember, we talk about governance and institutions in terms of some of the rules that regulate relationships and so on, between actors, so on and so forth, partly hierarchical. What if those rules include the use of violence repeatedly? So we talk about violence becoming institutionalized. So the mafia in Sicily, or urban violence being institutionalized in big cities in Brazil. Or we talk about apartheid South Africa, an institutionalized form of violent governance, arguably, and so on and so forth. What about the third idea, and we've actually already been talking about it, that violence might be a source of improved governance? I might come back to this later, and in case I don't, I'll say it now. There's a very, very beautiful, in a way, argument by Michel Foucault, who wrote, and he's not the only one to have written this, he just wrote it in a very particular, striking way in a lecture he gave in the Collège de France in Paris in the 1970s, which is to say that the blood of very real battles, didn't mean a metaphor, real blood of real battles, dries in legal codes. And what he's saying is laws, improved, better relationships between states and societies, between states, between people, improved governance, typically comes from the settlement of horribly violent conflicts. Okay? So we could see, and I'm not saying the linkages are one of these three things. I'm saying these are three different ways in which you might want to think, they might all go together. Might want to think about some of the linkages between violence and governance. Okay? Do you want to just sort of tell me what you think about any of these before I move on? Anybody? No? Give me some examples of violent governance, right? Where the rules of the game are a little bit. There's a kind of funny mixture of almost what we think of as good governance, but also repeated, almost expected violence. Okay, I'll give you an example, and then you can tell me it's terribly wrong and bad. Electoral competition in which fairly nearby country? Kenya. There is an argument that ever since, all right, Daniel Arap Moi was persuaded to introduce multi-party democracy again, so on and so forth in Kenya, that actually electoral competition has been institutionally violent. That's the way it's been done and expected to be done by the different players. And we're still, since 2007-8, we're still trying to work this through. It wasn't a war, but my goodness, what's feeding into changes in the constitution in Kenya is related to these conflictual problems. Yes? So there we're talking about maybe, I don't know, at least two of these at the same time, where the electoral competition is actually kind of, you know, it's not written in a law, but it's informal but very powerfully institutionalized form of violent governance, but it's also maybe producing changes which we hope. I mean, it would be lovely to get there without that. Of course, that's what we all want. But we have to see sometimes these are the ways in which change comes about. Okay. Now, what's the timing? Back to it. There's a book that Douglas North and his colleagues wrote called, what is it called? Violence and Social Orders, I believe. It's a really important and interesting book, where they talk about, you know, the difference between limited access orders and open access political societies, so on and so forth, and the different ways in which these types of society manage the violence problem. But really it is a kind of very, very detailed, sophisticated, interesting argument about the formation of coalitions whereby you need, there's sort of two things really. That somebody has to be able to make a credible threat. So you have to be able to threaten me that if I try using violence against you, it's not going to work. But more than that, if I'm going to put aside my guns, my AK-47s and so on and so forth, I have to know that the nasty rival of mine over there is also going to lay down her or his weapons. How can I trust this? Okay. So one thing is the sort of Giustozzi thing about the accumulation of the monopoly of force. But the other is that maybe I can trust, not only because you're threatening me and I begin to believe you, but also maybe both I and my nasty rival have a shared interest in renouncing violence. And the reason we would have that shared interest in renouncing violence is if violence reduces the privilege of being an elite. It reduces the value of the rents that we get as rival elites. So maybe we think, okay, I know you hate me, but let's just, you know, it's better we both kind of can stay rich, keep getting richer and richer, and we just stop fighting, so on and so forth. All right. There's an interesting assumption here. There's an interesting idea that you know, that violence and wealth are incompatible, and I don't really agree with that. But anyway, this is the argument. But it takes us into this discussion of more the kind of economic change, the development dynamics behind or related to violence and governance. And that's what I want to talk about a little bit more. But the idea, in a way, in Douglas North stuff, is that the systematic generation of rents, non-competitive profits, all right, above the profit you would get from a perfectly competitive market. That's a definition of rent in a way, okay? That systematically generating elite rents, that's naughty economics in a way, okay? Makes for good governance because it reduces violence. It's an interesting combination of ideas. Bad governance economically might make for good governance politically in a way, okay? Now, do you want me to talk about trends in violence? Yeah? All right. Because part of this is about saying, well, how big a problem is it? What kind of problem is it? How do we get at the problem? And the thing is, usually when I do this, I talk for hours about this. So we're going to have to work out how to deal with this. Because there are, when you want to know how much violence or insecurity there is in the world or in a particular country, you've got the following challenges. You have to have a system of classification. You've got to categorize. So we might have a category called civil wars. How many civil wars are there, right? We might have a category called, I don't know, internal violence, or so on and so forth. We can give different labels to types of violence. And then the second challenge is getting the evidence. So we say, there's an observation. We'll put this thing that we observe here, we've got evidence on this, goes in that basket called civil wars. This goes in urban violence, not civil wars, so on and so forth. You see the issue? Analytically, that's what we have to do. And both of these challenges are really difficult. The first one, how do you make a category? You put a line around something. Okay, you put a fence around it. You say everything inside here is called civil wars. Everything out there is called something different. Wars between countries and so on and so forth. Okay? That line, that barbed wire fence around the category is, each thorn on the barbed wire is what a statistician calls a coding rule. It's a definition. Right? Whenever blah, 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 you have to have that in order to be called a civil war, let's say. Not a war between countries. So you've got the definitions, right? And then you've got the problem of the evidence and whether it's reliable. Okay, so bear those two things in mind and ask yourself, is it always obvious what the difference is between, let's say, a civil war and a war between countries? Is there any such thing as a truly internal war in Africa in recent years? Is there? Just tell me before we go on. Can we treat Somalia, can we treat DRC as internal conflicts? Yeah? Go on. Now, you've already spoken. Someone else, tell me. Silent. Just hand gestures. Make voice gestures. No. Okay. Exactly. It's really hard. They're all regionalized conflict complexes. They're globalized because they're not sustainable without the money flows, the arms flows, etc., the ideas flows, the diaspora flows. So it's difficult, these things. Anyway, right. And lots of different organizations struggle with this. They try and say, the world's getting a lot better. Okay, how do we know? Well, because we know that after the Second World War, there were more and more, I can't even see the colors anymore. Anyway, believe me, the top line is this one. Okay, and it's the sum of that and that. So these are so-called internal conflicts. And these are interstate, between-state conflicts. Add them together, you get this. And what you find out is that after the Second World War, the majority of conflicts were so-called internal ones, and there were more and more of them until the end of the Cold War. After which, there's a decline. And what's really interesting, and you need to spend some time with, is to look at different organizations. And you look at this ski slope, this mountain range here. Because in some of them, early on, it was just a line straight down like this. And everybody said, it's brilliant, war is over. We live in a lovely world now. And then they thought, oh, help, it's gone up again. And you look in the different organizations and you see the lines vary. But we won't go into too much detail there. But the reason that line is different from that line, okay, is because of my two issues. The definitions change and differ between organizations of what they're measuring, and they use different sources of evidence. So to give you one example of the evidence problem, all right, it might not look like it, but that's Colombia in Latin America. And what some very interesting researchers did was they said, look, Colombia figures in big international data sets, all right, of civil war and so on and so forth. And when you look at the levels of violence in recent years in Colombia, according to those international data sets, this one particularly, the Uppsala, it's in Sweden, Uppsala Conflict Data Project, you find this trend. That's their upper guess, this is their lower guess. What happens if you use a different data set, looking only at Colombia and looking within Colombia, you come up with a different trend. It looks the same but higher until the late 1990s, after which something really, really dramatic happens, which is not captured in the international data sets. Got any ideas why? What might account for that difference? Why a Colombian exercise in collecting evidence, estimating battle deaths or whatever it may be, all right, is so much higher than the international estimate, looking at Colombia and DRC and everywhere else? Why? It's an incredibly simple answer. The people who did this study can read Spanish. Right? The people who do these look at English language news sources mainly. These people, they looked at more data, looked at the Spanish language literature. They found, and they were very careful not to double count incidents of violence and so on and so forth. That's really, really interesting. But the point I'm trying to make is simply one about the difficulty in always being able to trust the evidence. Where does it come from? Today, our glorious government forces killed 3,000 of the nasty rebels, and one of our generals had a slight scratch on his hand. Okay? Can we verify this information? That's one of the, eyewitness reports, political statements. The evidence on these things is often very hard to gather and to trust. The same goes for what are the levels of violence, what's reported by the police or what's not reported in terms of urban violence in Sao Paulo, in Recife, in Rio de Janeiro, in Brazil, or wherever, or in Cape Town, in South Africa. Or if we want to estimate the number of rapes, there's a very interesting argument about the overall level of casualties in DRC and the way in which the estimates, there's no discussing the fact that it's just appalling, horrible. But there is a very good argument that some of the estimates are way, way too high. And there are good reasons we can talk about why that might be, if you want. Then you look at other types of violence and you say international terrorist attacks have declined. It's really good news. But big ones have increased, which is more significant. What's the purpose? How do we deal with this stuff? We can look at homicide. There's trends in all of these things. Just pause for a little bit and not look at the debates, but just think, what's the trend? Even if we can't fully trust the data, there is something in terms of warfare that is quite interesting. Okay? We are below the late 1980s peak. Okay? Very, very definitely. But we haven't eradicated these wars and violence. Right? In some countries, there's also an argument that there are not only fewer wars, but they're nicer wars. They're less violent. In Colombia, I'm not sure the evidence suggests that. Okay? And then, terrorism, homicide in developing countries seems to have increased really dramatically then, in the late 90s and so on and so forth. Again, difficult to flash. Another way of capturing data is this. You go round townships in Johannesburg, or in this case, areas in Cali, in Colombia, and you talk to people. So they talked to a 13-year-old girl, and they said, what are the threats that you face, that you live with daily? And her classification system, all right, produced this, not a kind of graph and blah, blah, blah. And they're all called different things like, flights, rapes, drunks, mistreatment, gangs, etc., etc. It's just her classification system. They come up with lists of like 30 different types of violence in some Colombian cities that people listed, and so on and so forth. Very interesting. Okay, I want you to ask me questions or tell me stuff about measuring violence, about trends, before I move on. Yes? Could somebody give him them? Yeah.
What is the difference between total violence?
This is a simple classification system that says there are two types of war. There are wars within countries. Right? A different data set would call them civil wars. And there are wars between countries. Okay? And so what at one point might have been classified here in Sudan is currently pretty damn close to being one of these, a war between countries, yes? So the total is simply, when you add this and this in each year, you get that. Okay? Now, this is just, this is kind of wars. To be a war, there are strange coding rules, definitions. And one of them is that you have to have, one of the definitions goes like this. If you have 25 or more battle deaths, 2 forces, and there's a battle and each year, 24 or more, but not many more than that, you're a minor armed conflict. If you have more than 1,000 battle deaths spread over, let's say, 3, 7, 5 years, you are an intermediate armed conflict. This is very strange. This is how statisticians work, okay? But if you have more than 1,000 battle deaths in 1 year, you are a war. It's arbitrary. The definition is arbitrary. Why 1,000? Why not 500, 100, 2,000? Why? There's no real reason. Why not the percentage of the population? Because 1,000 battle deaths in China would be very different from 1,000 battle deaths in Burkina Faso, because the populations are so different. So as a percentage, the violence is much less intense in one than the other. These are arbitrary. Why it matters in one way is that what people do with the data and the rules is they feed them into models, statistical analysis. And they say, ah, look, our data shows us that there are important, possibly causal correlates between level of income, level of democracy, whatever, and civil war onset, let's say. But if your data is arbitrary and unreliable, and different people have different estimates, maybe your arguments, your claims about what causes these wars are dodgy. And there was a brilliant statistical exercise. One person, he took a data set called correlates of war that a lot of people use. And then he had a little model with some of the common things people think are important to why there are wars, civil wars, like level of democracy, like level of income per capita, so on and so forth. And he threw these variables, the data on them, at different versions of the same correlates of war data set, because they keep changing the rules. And he found that what that does is it produces correlations which are really different. In some of them, there might be a change between a variable, let's say level of income per capita, being positively and significantly correlated, or negatively and significantly correlated with the onset of civil war. And in another version of the same data set, it's negatively correlated but not significant. For level of democracy, this is a guy called Nicholas Sambanis, for level of democracy, in one version, the relationship was a positive correlation, in the other version it was a negative. This is just by changing the rules on how we define these things. This makes you very concerned about how much you can trust the big arguments and claims people make. Right? Anything else on this, the data, before I move on? Okay, I want to talk about 2 broad ways of thinking about the relationships between more sort of economic development and violence and government issues. And the first, this one is a 1 there, involves this character here. Okay, we'll come to him. We'll meet that character in a moment. The idea here, and it's an old and really interesting idea, okay, is that, well, the new version of it is this, is that there was a 2003 World Bank report called Breaking the Conflict Trap. It's very good, it's very interesting. And it had a claim in it, which is war is development in reverse. I said this earlier. War retards development, it puts it backwards, and development retards war. This is a very, very powerful set of ideas. And at first sight, it seems obvious. Yes? Because war is destructive. It's obviously destructive. at the human level, the institutional level, the economic level, so on and so forth, and the physical level. Okay? Because of that kind of claim and the arguments behind it, you then get the next argument, which is that development is conflict prevention. That's an incredibly powerful idea. If you do economic development and governance development, you will have perpetual peace. This is something called the liberal peace thesis. And it goes back in history a long way. It's an incredibly rich, powerful set of ideas. But as a way into a modern way of thinking about this, there's one of my favorite books is by, there's a genius, a wonderful, wonderful man called Albert Hirschman. He's an economist, but he did a lot more than that. And he wrote, one of the many books he wrote is called The Passions and the Interests. And it's a historical argument. And he writes, he says, I'm almost embarrassed to write this. It's a sort of weird historical curiosity. No one thinks like this nowadays. But let me tell you about something people used to think about hundreds of years ago. And it is the idea, and so the subtitle of the book is Political Arguments for Capitalism Before Its Eventual Triumph. Because the idea was, people argued, and it was kind of quite, well, the progression of the argument is like this. There are horrible, nasty impulses we have called human passions. Okay? We are led to do nasty things to each other. However, people began to see something interesting happening as capitalism kind of got underway and spread and economic activity diversified and so on and so forth. And there was an argument that all this money-making and interest, it's naughty, it's evil, but maybe it's not as bad as some of the other things we do to each other, like cutting each other's heads off and so on and so forth. So let's make a distinction between the passions, the really bad stuff, and the interests, the, okay, we can live with it, bad stuff. Okay? Drive for profit and competition and so on and so forth. Now, the next step in the argument is this, which is, what if the lesser evils, the interests, the economic interests and so on and so forth, can be deployed against the greater evils, the passions? And this is the argument that, essentially, capitalism and economic development, right, represses violence. That's fantastic. You saw it in the work of, I mean, much later, Keynes, the great Keynes argued that, you know, the business of making money and so on and so forth channels man's passions and activities away from the really worst stuff. It's a long-running argument. All I want to do with Hirschman's historical story about this is really to emphasize this, as I did already say, that Hirschman, when he writes this book, and it is beautifully written and really interesting, says, you know, don't laugh at me too much, I'm just doing history here. No one thinks like this anymore. Right? He wrote this book in, originally, I think, in the 70s or early 80s. He said no one thinks like that anymore. Everyone knows capitalism and economic development is conflictual and blah, blah, blah. Well, the truth is, now, everybody does think like that. It's the conventional wisdom. So it's really interesting how these ideas change over time. Okay? One way in which they've changed is the argument that about why it's the economists' argument, one form of economic thinking about why there are wars. Okay? And this involves taking this gentleman here. Anyone know where he might be? He's in Monrovia, in Liberia. And he's just looted a department store. And maybe that's full of diamonds stuffed in a teddy bear, I don't know. But in terms of the... So you take this, and when you look through a kind of X-ray, what you see is that. Okay? That is the same as that. Okay? And what it is it's a utility of rebellion model. Okay? It says that the utility of rebellion, okay, because we are all rational people, we are individuals, and we calculate to maximize our utility. Okay? This is underlying principles of economic thinking. So the utility of rebellion is a function of these variables. The probability of victory, obviously, if there's a greater chance I'm going to win, my utility of starting a rebellion is higher. But that itself is related to government. It's not, it says here, this is wrong, it's not government defense expenditure, it's potential government defense spending. I'll tell you why in a second. It's also a function of the gains on victory. I mean, if I'm going to lead a rebellion and all I win is, you know, some poxy little apartment on the outskirts of town, why? Okay? But if I get, you know, et cetera, all the oil and so on and so forth, the rent, it's how long is it going to take, do I think? And it's how difficult will it be for me to organize this? Right? You can't measure any of these things because this is potential government defense spending. You can get at it indirectly. So when we try to measure things indirectly, we call them what? If we have one variable, because we're trying, yeah, what was that? Proxies. I want to understand this, but I can't measure it. So, well, maybe this looks like that, and I can measure it. It's a proxy. So the proxies here are quite fun. So how do we have a proxy for potential government defense spending? I'm Nelson Mandela. I'm thinking, armed struggle? No armed struggle. Which shall I do? I'm Jonas Savimbi. Shall I do rebellion first against Portugal and then against the MPLA in Angola, so on and so forth? Shall I do it or not? How much are my opponents possibly going to be able to spend on beating me? Well, the richer the country, the more they can spend on, they can reallocate resources to the army, to the defense bill. If there's a lot of natural minerals, they can increase the rate of production, maybe, of oil, of barrels per day. And then they can spend more on the army and so on and so forth. But maybe, this is the interesting one, in this original model, this is a very early version of these models, inequality. And the story here was, the greater the inequality, the greater the inequality, the less the probability of rebellion. Why? That's the opposite to what you might think. The higher the inequality, the less likely a war. Why? It's because of this. Any reasoning? Any thinking? If there is high inequality, there is an elite that's doing rather nicely out of that inequality. Thank you very much. And so they will say to the government, listen, I know we don't really pay taxes and stuff, but all right, we'll let you tax us for a while in order to increase defense spending so that you can preserve the status quo, because we're enjoying it. So the idea here is if there's very high inequality, there's very, very high potential government defense spending and therefore a lower utility of rebellion.
Sorry.
Yeah, I'm sorry too, by the way, but yeah, go on. Sorry?
That assumption is based on the international conflicts?
No, this is about internal conflicts. Internal conflicts. So I'm saying if I'm in South Africa, I'm Nelson Mandela, I'm the ANC leadership, I'm thinking, you know, it's not funny doing armed struggle, but should we do it? And this model is saying these are some of the things that in one way or another they think about. People think about before deciding whether to start a rebellion or not. Get the next one. All right, the other one I want to, yeah? Is that all right? Yeah. The other really interesting one is what's a proxy for the organizational cost of starting a rebellion? It's one of my great friends, the Ethno-Linguistic Fractionalization Index. The Ethno-Linguistic Fractionalization Index. It is a measure of the probability that the next person I bump into in the street comes from the same ethnic group as me or a different one. And again, there's a reasoning, there's an idea behind here. The idea might be that the higher the score, the greater the probability that the next person I meet is different. In other words, very, very diverse. Okay? What am I going to say next? The more ethnically, linguistically diverse the society, what happens to the probability of war? Decreases. Increases. You see, we're not sure here. The argument here is it decreases because it gets harder to organize a rebellion. oh my goodness, I have to persuade those people whose earlobes are slightly different angle from mine and who speak with a slightly funny accent compared to me, or their dialect, to trust me and to join in my rebellion. I mean, that's the argument. Go on. You're absolutely right. These are very important examples, and there are more we could think about as well. Two ways of looking at that. One is to say, look, I'm telling you the normal argument, the common argument. You don't have to believe me. You don't have to agree with me. But the second way of because there is another way of thinking about it as well. But the second, some of which I'll come back to later. The second way is to say, yeah, that's sure, but really we're interested in statistics. And when we look at statistics, we find that, okay, here we're dividing countries. So the highest quintile is the richest 20% of countries in the world. The next richest, the middle-income countries. All right? And then we go to the very poorest countries, and the yellow one is the next poorest. So these are one graph. You just have to keep flicking between them. And they tell us something about the level of income per capita and the incidence at that range of level of income per capita of warfare. And what you find is, you know, it's not that all wars are in the most poor countries. There are some in more advanced countries. And the interesting thing is that at some periods, the level of conflict in the middle-income countries has been higher than in either of the second or the lowest quintile, the very poorest country. And even more interestingly, arguably for long periods of time, the second ones up have had a higher incidence of conflict than the very poorest. That itself might generate a hypothesis that development may be a lovely thing and it may be conflict prevention, but not at first. It may be that socioeconomic development, which is a hugely disruptive, conflictual process, there are winners and losers throughout the whole thing, is conflictual. It often does generate this, and then eventually maybe it also settles down. So that's a variant of the argument. But thank you for that. I think it's a very sensible point that you're pointing out. So this stuff, this guy eventually turned into arguments associated with a very, very well-known economist called Paul Collier. He kept on doing different versions of his model. It's a little bit slippery, but most famously, he had this model about greed and grievance. Are civil wars driven by greed or by grievance? How do we know? Let's go and measure. We're social scientists. Let's get the evidence. But how do you measure statistically grievance and greed? Proxies, again. So you can think of the mnemonic. So just look at the word, G-R-I-E. Growth in the 5 years before onset of a war. Repression, G-R. What's I? Louder, louder. No, growth's in there. Inequality. What's E? We've already met it. The ethno-linguistic fractionalization index. Okay? These were the proxies for grievance. What about greed? Do the same thing, G, R, and E. It's a bit different. Goodies, G for goodies, by which I mean this is my mnemonic, not his. The percentage of primary commodity exports in GDP. The diamonds inside the teddy bear. Okay? R for, again this is me, not him, rascals. The percentage of 50 to 24-year-old males in the population. Okay? And E is education, average years of schooling, which is in fact a proxy in itself for unemployment, which is even harder to measure than educational enrollment. The idea being here, there are two rival causal hypotheses. One is that wars are caused by grievance, all right? Stagnation, repression, inequality, ethnic difference and conflict are what drive people to start wars. Or it's where you have a large number of unemployed and poorly educated boys in the presence of bright, shiny goodies. All right? Lootable resources. Okay? Greed. Which is it? You go out and you get the data and blah, 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 and you say, lo and behold, it's greed. Okay? I don't want to go into the evidence and the statistics. There are so many problems. I mean, we can talk about them, but we have a time problem. I would love to know what you think about this model in general and some of its strengths and its weaknesses. However, what I really want to do for now is just to say two things. One is, if the evidence did suggest that there was a closer correlation, that doesn't necessarily mean causality, remember, but it's assumed here that it does. If there's a closer correlation between the greed indicators than there is with the grievance ones and civil war, why would it be? Why would an economist, a rational choice economist, argue that this would be the case? Never mind whether it's true or not for now, and whether this is a good way of measuring it. Just, can you think of the rationale? Why would it be true? What argument might I deploy? I don't want you to think about, oh, I don't believe this, it's blah, 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 or the wrong proxy, or, you know, just assume it's true that the greed is more strongly correlated with the war. Why would that be? Why would it be that the grievance variables don't seem to predict war, civil wars, but the greed ones do? Hang on, just let her... No? She's giving up.
No, I just wanted to get clarity.
Okay, fine, fine. Yep, we've got an idea over here. You're all right, it is to do with mobilization and individual rationality and so on and so forth, and selfishness. The argument is that there is something, you know, that it's very, very difficult to achieve collective action. Okay? So there are the kind of, basically, the argument is that overcoming these, all right, having good, rapid development, which is inclusive, lovely equality, so on and so forth, freedom, so on and so forth, ethnic harmony, all of these things, these are public goods that are provided collectively. And because of the individual selfishness and so on and so forth, the difficulties of mobilizing across classes between elites and poorer people, so on and so forth, it's really difficult to get people to do things. Above all, for the following reason, which is that where there are public goods, it's not that I don't want these things, and I might think about fighting for them, it's that there are too many free riders, okay, because it's a public good is, by definition, something you cannot exclude people from enjoying. If I put a street light in my street, and I pay for it, everybody in the street benefits. That's why I'm not going to do it, unless the government taxes me, and the government does it. The government provides public goods, security, street lighting, so on and so forth, okay? Nice roads, etc. So the issue here is, okay, I want these things, but if I lay down my life for these things, or risk it, why would I do that when these lazy people over here are staying at home waiting for me to do it for them? Okay? They are free riders. No, no. No, I'm not going to do it. So these things are real, but the idea is they don't clear the market for conflict because of the free rider problem. On the other hand, if you can provide direct material rewards, and where are they? They're outside the suites. Okay. Direct material rewards to me, now, well, maybe we'll get freedom and equality and so on and so forth, but also I'll get diamonds, and that's fine, thank you very much, you know, okay? Or someone else's land, or whatever it may be. So this is the argument for why it might be the case. Actually, on the suites, can I do this? There was I had a bunch of South African policymakers at SOAS in London in the summer, and I put on a series of lectures for them, a little bit like this. It was very good fun, and there was a French economist, and she was great, but I found it embarrassing. She said that every time one of them asked a question, if you ask me a question, I will give you a suite, she said, you know. And I found it slightly embarrassing that there was a very senior South African government minister, and he asked a question, really serious, and she said, oh, you're a very good boy, you can have a sweetie. I don't think he was doing it for the direct material reward, anyway. So that's the argument. Actually, there's been a lot of research and argument around this model. Okay? Many people disagree with it, including orthodox economists. So it's been shot down by friendly fire, if you like. But also non-orthodox economists, people who aren't economists, sociologists, anthropologists, etc., argue that there are lots of other ways you can overcome the collective action problem. That's the one way, but you can also do it by, the Joseph Kony way. You press gang, you kidnap people, you force them. Renamo in Mozambique, etc., etc. UNITA in Angola. But there are other things, which is actually maybe people do. Maybe it's not like, today tomorrow I tell you, here's a nice idea, equality, and you say, oh yeah, great, I'll die for it. It takes time to generate, but people do have beliefs. Collective, social beliefs. There are ideologies. People do act for these things. And the third thing is that there may be actually more complicated than this, is that in situations of violence, there's usually a joint production. A bit like your mobilization question. You have people at a kind of national level or whatever who have one kind of argument, but at the local level, people often volunteer for violence for very particular local reasons. They're not necessarily interested in the overall growth rate or whatever. They're interested that their neighbor has 2 more cows than they have. Or their neighbor went off with your wife, or whatever it may be. And really, the research suggests these things can be very, very powerful drivers of behavior. And so on and so forth. Anyway, there are so many arguments about this thing. Orthodox economists, as I said, there's friendly fire. They argue that it's just, actually the model is really it's bad statistics. Okay? The variables are wrong. Other people, it doesn't even reflect recent economic theory. And that actually the data doesn't support the conclusions. One of the versions of these sort of arguments might be that, if you remember, we go back to our proxies. Why is low level of education a proxy for greed? Might it not just as easily be a proxy for grievance? People might be really, really angry at the lack of provision of enough or good quality education. It might be both at the same time. And with every one of those variables, those proxies, there are all sorts of empirical and analytical problems. The data, even if inequality is an interesting proxy, the data on inequality is often very poor. Okay? I would bet that the Gini coefficient measure for Ethiopia has not yet captured the increasing inequality within this country. It's nothing like many countries, but nonetheless, it's historically kind of very low Gini coefficient. I don't think it's quite accurate for various reasons. And that's not just for this country. And so on and so forth. And what the orthodox economists said about this model, where they really, really wanted to dig the knife in, they said that the model might be published in an international relations journal, but not in a decent economics. That's very nasty. This was in a review. By the way, all of these arguments were made in an independent review of World Bank research from 1998 to 2005. Okay. We haven't got time to talk about post-conflict aid. What I do want briefly to say is that there are some, well, we've kind of already mentioned them, there are some other ways in which people think about the relationships between social and economic development and violent conflict. And one is, I think I mentioned the mafia earlier in Sicily and related argument. There's a long argument that the mafia in Sicily, southern Italy, okay, is a throwback. It's a leftover from an era before modern economic development capitalism. But actually, most of the recent research on the history of the mafia suggests that it's actually very much a product of modernization. The mafia began and evolved functionally as a sort of weird governance structure precisely in those parts of Sicily that, in terms of commercialized mining, but also the citrus sector, the lemons and oranges and so on, were being commercialized and globalized very, very rapidly. The mafia grew up in those particular sectoral and geographic parts of Sicily. It was a strange, nasty form of violent governance and rules that was a product of modernization, not a leftover from pre-capitalism. Okay? So we have to be careful with the prettier liberal ideas. They're too simplistic sometimes, that everything about all good things go together. There's economic development, faster rate of growth, and that means everybody's happy and less violent. It doesn't historically work like that, okay? In Colombia, we talked a little bit about Colombia, has somehow managed to sustain high levels of violence with really quite high rates of economic growth over long periods of time. Okay? It's a bit related to your Iran and Iraq stories. Another little example in Africa, Angola, 1961 is where it all kicks off in a way. Well, it doesn't. It kicks off in 1580 whenever Diogo Cal landed. But in 1961 was really the beginning of Angolan modern warfare. It was the sort of spark for the UNITA, the MPLA, and the FNLA rebellions. And it began in rural northern Angola, driven by a coffee sector boom. World prices for coffee post-Korean War had skyrocketed. Portugal reacted to this by sending lots of poor Portuguese farmers to Angola, stealing Africans' land, all right, and producing lots and lots of coffee in very unpleasant circumstances, treating migrant laborers very, very badly. All right? So it was brutal, and it was a boom time thing for a short period of time. But then the boom turned to bust and stuff. But it was the boom and the drive of some form of quasi-capitalist coffee production for the global market and this rapid expansion that generated the grievances in a sense. Right? And there were rebellions around kind of non-payment of wages to migrant laborers, also around the theft of land and so on and so forth, that formed the basis for a local rebellion, which then was taken on by the rebels who were still kind of based in neighboring countries in a way. And then it kicked off the whole rebellion. Right? The point is the things that we often associate with economic development are often also associated with conflict, violent or otherwise. We often assume that it's the unemployed and the poor who have a comparative advantage in violence. There's somebody who literally argues that. And these data, these models I've shown you, often throw this idea of unemployment. The data are not good enough to confirm this either way. But also that argument ignores the way in which it's not only unemployment that sometimes drives people to voluntarily participate in violence, in gangs or in wars and so on and so forth. It can also be the kind of employment. If you're employed in particularly nasty terms, if the governance of labor markets is exploitative and violent, which it is often itself, physically and structurally, that itself can be a driver. Never on its own, but combined with political ideas, norms, possibly regional or ethnic inequalities, so on and so forth. Small example to give you this, a bit of backup here, is in Colombia again. There is evidence that a lot of the people who have volunteered to join the FARC rebellion in recent decades were not only employed for wages before they joined, but they were paid above average wages. We have to be careful with this assumption about absence of development. Unemployment is necessarily always the main drivers, okay? And there's a bigger argument. I mean, I'm going to end with one thing, one sort of point really. It's a very abstract one, and it's a very historical one, and it's the argument that something that's common in violent conflicts, in Mozambique, in Angola, in DRC, and so on and so forth, in Somalia, that something that's common there is a mechanism that's often common also in the history of economic development. In other words, we later come to see it as progressive. And it is something we call primitive accumulation. People often associate it with Marx, because it's a Marxist phrase. But Adam Smith actually used the same idea. He talked about something called original accumulation. And it's It's the so-called non-economic force used to accumulate the original assets and capital, which then are the basis for more economic reinvestment and development and so on and so forth. And what it often involves is, it often does involve what nowadays people talk rather lazily about in terms of land grabbing. Right? It separates people from their own subsistence well. They can't survive anymore. Their land's too small, it's been stolen, whatever it may be. They are forced either into destitution or into labor markets. Nobody particularly, I've spent the last few days looking at this, partly going out of town and interviewing poor rural workers and so on and so forth. Nobody particularly wants to become a wage worker, but you have to eventually, very often. Okay? That process at the start is nasty. At least it always has been. It was in England and so on and so forth. Over time, it often kicks off processes that we come eventually to see as progressive. And the interesting thing is that wars very often contain this mechanism, so that so war is destructive. You have to think it's two things at the same time. Of course it's development in reverse. But sometimes these other mechanisms are taking place too. They're not necessarily pretty, but they are. Now, this picture in a way captures some of these dynamics. It's a picture that I took in South Africa in the early 1990s, just before, during the transition. And next door in Mozambique, it was right towards the end of the war. The war ended in 1992, so this might have been just a little bit. Yeah, I think this was in 92, because I was living in Mozambique and visited South Africa, so on and so forth. Right. So, in this part of South Africa, there are a large number of illegal Mozambican immigrants. They had illegally crossed through the Kruger National Park, so on and so forth, into South Africa. Many of them were women. Right, this is a drawing on one of their huts by a young girl of what had happened to her mother inside Mozambique and why they'd fled. Okay, it's horrible. But this girl living with her aunts and so on and so forth, what were the aunts doing? Illegal immigrants inside South Africa. They were employed for wages, very low wages, on the farms, the big commercial farms that produced export crops, avocados and so on and so forth, for European supermarkets. Right? So war in Mozambique, through the thing of displacement and so on and so forth, was in a way creating, okay, labor force relations and profitability in global capitalist markets. So the expansion of the horticultural sector in South Africa. It's not nice, but it's interesting. And it's not just war as development in reverse. Inside Mozambique, research by people like Mark Voigt, so on and so forth, suggests that actually war was in some ways development in reverse, but in other ways, the long, protracted war in Mozambique accelerated processes of class formation and differentiation that we, I have to stop, that we come to see maybe eventually as development. All right? Sorry, I've banged on too long. I'm going to stop. Angelica's shutting me out. Okay. Should have brought it back round to governance again, but anyway. Okay. Are we allowed to talk a bit or not?